what Andres went through was showed you why this part of the population that's only 9% of the vote is so disproportionately important in presidential elections, which of course drives politics in America. Because there has been, as Andres showed, is that the key to Bush's victories in 2000, 2004, we didn't go into the detail, we can if we want to discuss it more, was the flip that happened with the Hispanic community. There's no way to understand Bush's victories in 2000, 2004 without understanding that the shift in the Hispanic allegiance from being overwhelmingly Democratic to being more of a swing vote was the thing that tipped many states from being lean Democrat to red states. And what we also learned in recent days is that the public opinion, so first of all in politics, Hispanics matter, and they become a battleground part of the American electorate. And it is no accident, I think, that the first Supreme Court justice that nominated by Barack Obama was a wise Latina. Right? Second is that on public opinion, and we didn't spend that much time on it, but we can more in the Q&A, the polling numbers on immigration reform have been amazingly consistent for 3.5 years, since we really started this debate in the fall of 2005. An overwhelming majority of Americans support comprehensive immigration reform in virtually every poll taken. And this issue has been polled extensively in public and private polls. And what you're seeing with this new poll from America's Voice, which I strongly recommend for anyone online and in this room to check out, along with companion focus groups that go into more detail, is that in a down economy, actually support for comprehensive has gone up. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So in terms of politics, Hispanics matter. In terms of public opinion, overwhelming majority support for comprehensive. And let me go through some more thoughts for you about the debate this year. Just to remind everybody, right, comprehensive immigration reform is the name that we've all given to how a set of ideas about how to fix the broken immigration system. That it has three key components to it. That we're going to toughen up on the border and on employers who illegally hire undocumented workers. We're going to better manage the future flow of legal immigrants. And third is we're going to create legal status and a path to citizenship for those already here. All the bills that were debated in 2006 and 2007 had some set of these attributes, and certainly we all expect that whatever comes out this year, and we expect that Senator Reid will be certainly introducing something in the fall in the Senate, that it will have, again, these three core components. And they could change a little bit about from where they were a few years ago. This is sort of the undergirding, the structure underneath what we call comprehensive. That we also know that a clear and consistent majority, as I said earlier, has supported comprehensive. And again, it's poll after poll has shown the same thing. Americans really care about this issue. It's not a top-tier issue. It's not health care. It's not the economy. It's not Iraq back in the last election cycle. But it's number 4, number 5. It's usually equal to education, which is obviously something of great concern to Americans. And about 14, 15% of the country in every poll really is angry about the sort of the changing racial construct of America and have violent or angry sentiments about what's happening with immigration in America, whereas the rest of the country is in some other stage of indecision or as we saw in this new poll, desire to see 86%. We got the number all the way up to 86% in this last poll, right? So Andres went through this. I won't repeat this, but even when you, in this poll, again, that I strongly recommend because it's just 2 weeks old, right, that when you ask the question, do you support comprehensive immigration reform, just those words, right, it was 68%. When you defined what comprehensive actually was, as Andres said, it got all the way up to 86%. And frankly, Republican Party support was pretty high too. I mean, this wasn't really a significant variation between the Democrats and the Republicans. Remember that the Republicans had, in essence, a referendum on immigration reform in their presidential primary last year. And Tom Tancredo, who was a single-issue candidate, who ran essentially only on immigration reform, never got a higher than 1% ever in a Republican presidential primary. He never broke 1%. And John McCain, who was seen as the most liberal of all the Republican candidates who ran in 2008, won the primary. And if you remember also in the debate in the Democratic primary, Barack was seen as more liberal on immigration reform than Hillary, right? So both of the candidates who won their respective primaries in 2008 were so-called, more liberal, if you want to use that word, on comprehensive immigration reform. And clearly, Barack was to the left of McCain on this and still became the president with 53% of the vote. So there's a lot of evidence that this is something that even in a Republican primary is not something that is a third rail. Right? So what I would also argue is that in the age of Bush, when very little got done that was bipartisan, what happened in 2006 when comprehensive immigration reform was originally introduced with McCain and Kennedy, it was among the most bipartisan, common sense things that we saw happen in Washington. We got 62 votes in a Republican Senate on this so-called third rail issue. And behind it, which is still there today, is one of the broadest and deepest and most bipartisan coalitions ever assembled for a piece of legislation in this decade. You saw everything from immigrant rights groups to the Chamber of Commerce to evangelical Protestant groups to the Catholic Church. I mean, I will tell you, in recent years, working on this issue, I've never been in the room with so many priests, right, in my political career. And it's amazing how broad and deep this coalition is beneath comprehensive immigration reform. I give a lot of credit to Ted Kennedy and John McCain, who built the original bill that was able to build such a broad coalition behind it. But there is an enormous amount of bipartisan goodwill, in addition to toughness on this issue, but bipartisan goodwill that we can't forget that will be there again, I think, if we bring this bill up soon. And so my basic conclusion is that, unlike some people who have argued that there's no evidence that this is a third rail, right? This has got broad and deep bipartisan support in public opinion. There's been a broad and deep coalition behind it in Congress. It was able to pass in a very contentious political era and get through back in 2006. And I think we have to rethink this not as a contentious third rail issue or as a wedge issue, but as a deeply pragmatic and common sense approach to solving a national problem, right? And that's really what I think this debate has been about. So let me offer some other thoughts for you before we wrap up about why I think at the end of the day that we're going to see movement on comprehensive in this cycle. First is that the administration and Congress are going to become very wary of fighting proxy battles on other issues. And there was a story in Roll Call, I think, just in the last week about how where this is going to manifest itself very quickly is in the desire for the Democrats to cover everyone with health care reform. Does that mean that we're going to cover 11 million undocumented in the quest for universal health insurance? This is going to become an incredibly contentious issue in the next 6 weeks. And we've already saw in issue after issue in the stimulus and other issues that came up this year, anything that involves coverage of people starts to raise the question of will it cover the undocumented? And so my own belief is that Congress is going to continually get worn down and say, hey, why don't we just resolve this once and for all instead of having these proxy wars break out in issue after issue. Second is the pressure from state and local officials who are seeing law enforcement overwhelmed and seeing their local institutions overwhelmed by this question of the undocumented are going to continue to advocate for action. And I think that, again, these are going to become increasingly powerful voices as this debate goes on. Third, it's going to help depoliticize what could be a very contentious census fight next year. It is in the plank of the Republican Party, passed at the Republican Convention in 2008, that they will contest the ability for the government to count undocumented in the census. Now, we all may say, well, that's silly. I mean, the census, it's constitutional. We have to count everybody. Well, we know that it is perfectly capable of a party who is still fighting over a Minnesota Senate race, or who were able to win a presidency with a 5-4 vote by the Supreme Court, that we know is the Republican Party is completely capable of mounting a full-scale, sustained fight to prevent the undocumented from getting counted in the census. I mean, this is not out of the realm of possibility. And I think that fight would be racial and ugly in the extreme. And I think it's something that would do incredible damage to the country and something that I hope we can avoid by getting comprehensive immigration reform passed. Next, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, is that we like to call this that it's going to remove what we call the trapdoor under the minimum wage. When the Democrats came into office in 2007, one of the first things they did was raise the minimum wage. The premise was that by raising the wages at the bottom, that you remove some of the downward pressure on wages and incomes that it had manifested itself in the Bush era, right? But we left a trapdoor in that minimum wage. 5% of the workforce today is undocumented. If we want to stay true to the democratic argument that we have to raise the floor for all workers, we've got to deal with this 5% that are continuing to drag down wages and incomes in the United States. As we saw from polling, there's really only two ways to do that, right? Kick them all out or give them a path to citizenship and legal status. The American people overwhelmingly support the second option in that regard. Next is that study after study shows that by legalizing the undocumented, we're going to bring money into the federal and state treasuries, clearly something that's going to be attractive to people in this difficult economic time. And also, I think it's going to be increasingly seen as a vital part of any strategy to crack down on the increasingly violent border region. Certainly, this is part of the illegality that's happening along the border that we have control over. It's something that we can address this year. Next is that, and this is something we won't have that much time in to talk about today, but the immigration justice system simply wasn't built to manage the volume that it has now. And for any of you who know about what happens to undocumented immigrants, or the fact that the La Migra, right, can knock down your door in the middle of the night without a warrant and disappear you for 3 or 4 weeks with no habeas corpus rights. And it's happening regularly to American citizens who are born in this country, right? We even have situations now where we're seeing American citizens deported out of the United States because their name is the same as somebody else who's an undocumented. Is that this is just simply unacceptable for this country to allow the kind of injustice that exists in the immigration justice system to continue. And it's something I think that we can address in part through comprehensive. This is going to require a separate effort later to really clean up once and for all. And also, I think, and this is going to be something I'd love to talk about in this room, is that I think it's going to be very difficult for this administration, after spending months and months and months extolling the virtues of this Latina child of immigrants, Sonia Sotomayor, to then turn, particularly because she's going to become a Supreme Court justice, because I think she'll get through in September or October. There'll be weeks of press about the first Latina, to then turn around and say, oh, by the way, we're excited about her rise to fame and fortune and to see the extraordinary story of Sonia Sotomayor, but for those 11 million other Hispanic immigrants that want the same shot at the American dream, we're going to have to defer that to later. I think rhetorically that becomes very difficult. And you hear some Republicans argue that the administration are giving the Hispanic Sonia Sotomayor in order to disappoint them on immigration. I think it's the inverse. I think it's going to be very difficult now, after we've invested as a nation this huge extended period of discussion about the rise of Sonia Sotomayor, to then rhetorically deny Hispanics through pushing back comprehensive. And then finally, that comprehensive, as Andres talked about a little bit, has become a litmus test in the Hispanic Latino community, the fastest growing part of the American electorate. It is increasingly difficult. The Republicans have paid an incredible price by their demonization of Latino immigrants in the United States and the way they've handled the comprehensive immigration reform issue. I think it's one of the greatest political mistakes we've seen a political party make in America in the last 30 or 40 years of politics, and certainly I think this will continue to drive both parties' reactions to this issue. And then finally, in the age of reconciliation, racial reconciliation, that I think is the promise of Barack Obama and his election, is that it's going to be increasingly unacceptable, I think, for us to see the kind of extraordinary public manifestations of racism that have manifested themselves in the media and in politics around this immigration issue. If we really want to take the air out of the balloon of racism in the United States, this is something we must do, and hopefully do it sooner rather than later. So our advice to the two parties, right? Our advice is first to the Democrats, you promised, right? I mean, Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, Barack Obama, in every interview they've given in Spanish and English to Hispanic press, have said they're going to get this done. Next is that in recent years, right? Oh, I got that already. Now's the time to do it, right? And that third is that for the Democrats, it's also going to help lock in the gains that they've made, as Andre showed, which are going to be so consequential for their presidential aspirations in future years. Next is that our advice to the Republicans, sue for peace. I mean, there is simply no path forward for the modern Republican Party that doesn't involve a reconciliation with the Hispanic community. And I believe what it's going to require is actually a public repudiation of the racially charged tactics that they've used with Hispanics and African Americans and people of color in recent years. But certainly there's no way to imagine a modern 21st century Republican majority without reconciliation with Hispanics. And I think that if the Democrats make a good faith effort and really try to get this done, that if they oppose comprehensive this year, I think you're going to see this be the key to the Republican Party being in the minority for potentially 30 to 40 years in the future. So our conclusion on this is that it's really in the interest of both political parties to do this year or soon, and that both parties will gain from moving ahead on comprehensive. There's a bipartisan, pragmatic plan ready to go with broad public support and a deep and broad coalition ready behind it. There simply is no compelling political, economic, legislative, or moral argument against moving now, other than that what you're starting to hear from those who don't want to go ahead is that we're too busy, right? The schedule is too full. We really just can't get to it this year. The American people fundamentally reject that argument. The Democrats were elected to get things done. They view this as one of the 4 or 5 major things that Democrats need to do. And they simply are not going to be sympathetic to people in Washington saying, sorry, our plate's too full, we're going to have to defer this to some other time. Second of all is that I really believe that there is going to be tremendous cost to the Democrats if they don't move ahead on this. Not only will we see a contentious census, but it will undermine the central argument the Democrats have made to the American people that they came to Washington to solve problems and get things done. The American people see this as a big problem. The time is now. There's no reason not to go ahead. And I'm optimistic that with strong leadership that we can get this, and all of you to here working with us, that we can get this done in the next year or so. Thanks, everybody, very much. Happy to take your questions and comments.